Hello, and welcome to the Superhero's Guide to Grief, part of the Good Grief Festival. I'm Liesl Dawson, an associate professor at the University of Bristol, and I'm really excited to be able to facilitate this panel, where we will be talking about superhero origin stories, grieving styles, and much, much more. I'm delighted to introduce our panel. Ryan Airy is the writer, producer, and host of the immensely popular and secretly erudite Screen Crush YouTube channel, where he is proud to overthink every aspect of nerdy pop culture. He's created several popular series for the channel, including Scene Fights, Easter Egg Breakdowns, and What's the Point? As well as being a superhero expert, Ryan is also a comedian, writer, and award-winning director. Dr. Jill Harrington is a practicing social worker with a special focus on trauma, loss, and bereavement. She is also an adjunct professor for the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and a part-time lecturer for Rutgers University School of Social Work. Jill is the creator and lead editor of the new creative textbook, Superhero Grief, The Transformative Power of Loss. Finally, I'd like to welcome Jess Bacon, who is a freelance feature and creative writer with a focus on grief, mental health, film, and TV. As well as being a huge Marvel fan, she's also a podcaster and blogger who's prone to sharing the highs and lows of her life online. So welcome, everybody. It's great to have you on Good Grief. If I could just start us off first with asking a question to Ryan. Ryan, in what ways do superhero origin stories center on grief and trauma?
Well, superheroes, it's kind of cliche to say this, but they really are modern myths. They're just reinterpretations of stories that we've been telling for thousands of years. So you can kind of just as a root of this, look back at fairy tales. And in almost every fairy tale, there is a dead parent or an evil stepfather or stepmother. The home has to be splintered in some way because the child needs to feel less than whole. They need to feel like their life is fractured. And in some cases, like when they're an orphan, it makes them a fish out of water. You get the child from one kingdom who's placed in another. So applying that to superheroes, I guess let's look at like the three most popular: Batman, Superman, Spider-Man. Batman is the most obvious. He was a child and his family was taken from him in front of his very eyes. So he has this fear and trauma that he internalizes. But in order to get over that fear and trauma, he has to share it with these criminals. He has to make them afraid and make them feel trauma in order to get over his own grief. In fact, other people over the years, other writers have come in and tried to like add some nuance to Batman, to Bruce Wayne, and be like, oh, he had this childhood friend who he really liked, and then, you know, she died. None of it works as well. It's the most straightforward revenge story you can think of. And Superman is interesting because he is a parallel for immigrants, for that child whose parents like put him on the boat and just sent him off to the new world, and he got a new name, and that's it. Like he just has to completely rewrite his history. So Superman, I think, always felt a little bit melancholy about his birth parents. But the most important part of his origin is in some continuities when his Earth parents die, because that shows him that he may be super, but he can't stop death. You know, it's this thing that life is very fragile, and that more than anything taught him how to treat and how to be super, how to treat the people of Earth, how to, you know, like he's cradling an egg. And Spider-Man, another great example of like someone just being forced into maturity by trauma, someone who, like Batman, kind of internalized this guilt and is always, but instead of trying to hurt people and trying to make them afraid, he's trying to give people hope in a way and trying to just sort of live his own life. In fact, Spider-Man's the one that I always look at as like, for most kids, the most relatable, not just because he is a teenager, but because every teenage boy, especially teenage boys, have this moment of like, this feeling that they can do anything. Oh my gosh, like, especially, you know, being a cisgender white male in America, we feel like we're on top of the world all the time and the world's our oyster. And we all face this moment of responsibility and consequences for our actions, which, you know, Peter faces and then relives every day. Like every kid he doesn't save or every parent he doesn't save is his Uncle Ben.
That's beautifully put. I really like that. Jill, did you want to jump in on this question about the origins of superheroes and how there's grief and trauma at the center of many of their stories?
Sure. So agree a lot with my co-presenter here said, but just also wanted to add that the traumatic experience, if you pull it back, there's trauma is not homogenous. So, and also death is not ubiquitous. How people die really affect how they grieve. And, you know, the one thing, the universal storyline that can tap into almost every human being is this fear of loss. Because we all may not suffer trauma in our lives, but universally what ties us to our humanity is that we all will suffer loss. Now, all of us may not suffer loss violently. I mean, Superman, yes, he was an immigrant, but he also had the death and loss of his people through genocide. You know, Bruce Wayne becomes Batman. His transformation is based on the experience of the death of his parents. So what ties into these stories is the violent murder and deaths of their family members. There are three things that really set forth when people are murdered or killed. And that is our innate in our DNA to seek retribution, revenge, and retaliation. And that's often the path of those who are homicide survivors. And so most of these superheroes, their transformation comes in trying to build a sense of meaning. When people are killed violently or suddenly, our sense of meaning really is disruptive. Our sense of the world, our safety in this world is disrupted. And our sense of trying to make sense of the death is disrupted. So this really is the majority of the catalyst for the transformation of most superheroes, but also it is their own hero's journey in what they do, just like us, because these are human stories created about human struggles for humanity in mythology, what we do in our own journey and to make choices, to make their decisional points. I mean, Batman certainly has decisional points in what he needs to do. And sometimes it's not clean and it's complex and it's flawed. But they have these superpowers, which they can walk this line to either be destructive toward the world and the universe or destructive toward themselves.
That's really helpful. Yeah, no. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that the more you look around at superheroes, the more you see how much grief and trauma sort of begins their story and sets their story off as the kind of hero's journey, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if I could go back to Ryan and ask you, Ryan, if there are particular stories that you found moving, if there's particular examples that you would want to talk about or point to.
Sure. Well, I mentioned already Spider-Man. I think on a personal level, Spider-Man was always the hero that I related to the most, the geek in school, and that he was kind of that outcast in a normal social setting. But then that feeling of like guilt and responsibility, which is that key word for his origin story, responsibility. It's not the great power so much as it is the great responsibility, because you may not have great power, but we all still carry great responsibility as part of our social contract. So for me, that was always like the feeling to do right, you know, that stemmed from his grief. I don't think you need to have suffered grief in order to feel like you owe the rest of society something. But his story always resonated with me. And also, not technically a superhero, well, sometimes he is, but Magneto. It's somebody that, you know, now we take it for granted. Like the X-Men movie kicked off all these Marvel movies, and it opens with a scene in the Holocaust of Eric Lehnsherr, you know, having his mother torn from him. So we take it for granted that he was a Holocaust survivor. But Magneto, when you go back and you read the X-Men comics, like if you start in 1963, he is a completely ridiculous, mustache twirling villain who leads the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and he talks like a Saturday morning serial character, and he has no nuance whatsoever. He's just evil. He hates humans. Years and years and years later, 20 years later, Chris Claremont comes along and shows this flashback issue where it shows that Magneto and Xavier had a past, and they're both working in a hospital in Israel for Holocaust survivors. And Magneto, who's just called Magnus, reveals his tattoo. And in one panel, just one panel, they delivered a fully formed character to us. This person who, after that, you really understood why he felt this way, because his entire villainy and later his heroism, back to his villainy, because comics and that's what they do, was shaped by that trauma. And you can even go back and look at certain issues. Like there's an issue where he almost kills Kitty Pryde, who at that time would have been a 13-year-old tag along to the X-Men. And he's shocked that this was a child, like his children, you know, who were taken from him, like all the other children he saw taken in the Holocaust. So it gave this framework to everything else that he had done. So that, to me, is just one of the greatest moments, character-wise, of character development I've ever seen in a comic book.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, and the way in which, you know, he turns to killing, he turns to doing these things. I mean, as he says in one of the films, to make the pain go away, you know, but then he realizes, you know, that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Going back to Spider-Man, I wonder, one thing I find really interesting is you get the kind of original death of his uncle, but in a way you get this repeated father-son relationship later on with Tony Stark. And I just wonder if what you thought of that moment, because he kind of has the death of his uncle, but then in Endgame, he gets to come back and kind of witness the death of Tony Stark, who's kind of like a surrogate father to him.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons I find that really moving is because he sort of lost that opportunity with his uncle. And there's a way in which, you know, with Tony Stark, it's almost as if he gets a different kind of goodbye, although obviously it's also quite traumatic.
Well, Peter's an interesting case, especially when you look at the comics, because he lost his father figure. He obviously lost his real father, you know, when he was a child, doesn't remember him. And then he lost his father figure, Uncle Ben. And then every father figure that comes into his life after that, all the good ones die, like George Stacy dies. Then every other male in his life is a villain. Like all the older men in Spider-Man's lives are basically showing him what not to do and how not to become. And if you look at the movies, Adrian Toomes is the perfect example of that. He's a blue collar guy who basically did not get the support of the upper classes, you know, like from like people like Tony Stark. So Peter is like seeing these two paths ahead of him, you know, in that first movie, and even in the second movie to a certain extent, because Beck uses his science for evil and things. So when he sees that with Tony Stark, when he kind of gets to come full circle, I mean, that's when you watch your parents pass, your father figure pass, that's a rite of passage into maturity for him. And it's a great instance for Peter because it's something he cannot blame himself on. You know, this is not something that he will internalize as guilt or trauma. Well, he will trauma, but he won't internalize it as guilt. He will look at it as a positive example. Finally, a positive role model showing him this is how we use our great power, not to steal, not to like fake everybody out and try to achieve fame and revenge, but to lay it all on the line and to do what's right to help everybody.
Oh, that's so interesting. I like what you say about the alternative father figures as well. That's really interesting. Can I ask you, Ryan, recent series, and I'm thinking storylines, I'm thinking about WandaVision. Grief's featured not just as an origin, but as a main storyline of a show. I wonder if you can just say a bit more about this.
Sure. I'm also very much looking forward. I hope I'm not the only person that's going to talk about WandaVision, because I'm really looking forward to what everybody else has to say about it. The creators used I know it's outdated now, but the 5 stages of grief to kind of map out the series. But for me, the key episode was episode 5, the 80s episode. And I'm also like a massive fan of vintage sitcoms. So in the 80s, you started to see these, well, really the 70s, but then in the 70s, you saw some of these very special episodes, especially on All in the Family shows like that. But in the 80s, it was every single sitcom would have like at least one episode a season devoted to like Uncle Tom Hanks is an alcoholic, or especially the show Family Ties, or so the new African American family on the block just got like just got attacked by racists, that kind of thing. So you have this in WandaVision, this very special episode where the kids have to learn about death and deal with death for the first time. And what I think is very interesting about that episode is Wanda has this moment of like, she and Vision basically go through couples therapy together in it. They have this argument where they're working things out and they're shouting at each other and they can bring it down. And then there's this great moment where she sits on the couch and says, I don't even know how any of this started. And I thought, boy, that is somebody going through it. Like that is who in their life has not just gone through some horrible stuff and been detached from themselves, who just couldn't even remember the day before, let alone like the several days before that led them into this really dark, traumatic place. Because what she's done is surrounded herself with a lie, and she can't really find the origin of that. In the same way that when you face trauma, you typically will just find whatever makes you feel good and then just put that as a layer and then just build on top of that without ever really confronting the truth, and at least temporarily.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. Now, I think WandaVision, we will definitely be coming back to that in the rest of this panel. Jill, can I turn to you now? Can I ask you, first of all, what drew you to superhero stories?
That is I could answer a very long question that, but I will try to be brief in my comments. I am a kid who was born in Queens, New York in the early, I'm going to date myself here, 1970s. My father went to the same high school as, he didn't graduate, as both Stan Lee and Bill Finger and Bob Kane. And so as a kid growing up in the 70s in New York, we had a couple of channels on TV, which were like 3 channels and PBS. I would come home after school and flick on Batman and flick on Wonder Woman and Underdog. The comic book industry around me was prevailing. I was also a hybrid jock and a nerd at the same time, only girl on my block growing up. So, I loved, girls were typically the customers of superheroes back in the day. So, these were all characters I grew up with and loved, and I sort of was at the epicenter. But in my life, what really drew me in was back when I was about 12 years old, my sister suffered from a near fatal illness. And at the time, we did not know that a woman emerged from my mom's office. My mom worked in the medical industry in New York. And a woman emerged from there who was her friend. And we really didn't know her secret identity. But she was the sister of Bob Kane. And she had told Bob about the story of my sister and I, about my sister particularly, and about my struggle being the sibling who couldn't visit her in the hospital and the fear and everything. And if you look behind me, there's a personal cell drawn by Bob Kane to address to me and my sister. My sister also has the one of Catwoman. And just for no reason, he drew these beautiful comic cells, showing us really about what the superpower of kindness, reaching out to us kids, saying, I hope for a speedy recovery. I hope you're doing okay. Batman and Robin wish you well, even Catwoman, who, the anti-hero Catman. So that even just solidified all my love of superheroes. But in terms of superhero stories, I have a son who's on the spectrum personally. So my way to be able to find when you try to connect and talk to kids, especially through a lot of his own losses, especially children or adults on the spectrum, you try to connect in any way possible. And this is our language. And so superheroes became a language to talk about loss and talk about trauma. But in my professional world, I started in oncology, and I saw a lot of superheroes being used with children and adults, the archetypes really by healthcare professionals or people who'd come in, or when patients really needed to imbue a sense of what these images or these symbols mean, finding the strength of Wonder Woman or being able to find the bat signal meaning hope. But it was really in my work after 9/11 in New York, working with Project Liberty families, that really how I started using superheroes more in therapy was I had a child whose uncle had been killed in the towers, and I was seeing him for several weeks. He was a young adolescent male boy from Queens. And, he was shut down. He didn't want to, talk. I mean, most kids after a significant death, and also, we were culturally very different. And, his mother kept bringing him for grief counseling. And as a, child practitioner, knowing sometimes you just need to be and sit and be present to gain trust from kids. But this was going on for weeks with, in complete silence. And one day he walked in with a Batman t-shirt, and I knew Batman, that's someone I could relate to. And so it started a conversation. And so the superhero then became a bridge. And I talked to him about the fact that Batman had also been a survivor of someone in his life, his parents who'd been killed. So it opened up this therapeutic bridge, this connection for me now to create an alliance, or at least rapport with this child. and we were able to then work together.
That's really interesting. I think, and in a sense, there's so many connections you have with your own life and superheroes. I wonder if you can say a little bit about how the concept of the superhero came about. Like, how did this idea arise? I think you've written in your book about how the creators of superheroes are themselves, people who've suffered grief, and that it's not just the stories that we get, it's not just the characters who suffer grief, but in fact, grief is sort of part, potentially, of why the writers created these figures.
Well, it could be. We don't know, actually. It'd be interesting to find out but most of the creators of the original popular superheroes were all first generation sons of Jewish immigrants who were fleeing the Holocaust, mainly in Eastern Europe or in Europe. And so they came here to the United States, most of these families. I don't know if those families had loved ones that were, 6 million Jewish people were killed in Nazi concentration camps, and hundreds of thousands of more from World War I. So, these were folks who were fleeing to America to find a sense of safe harbor or any other place in the world. But they were met here in this country still, and unfortunately, with hatred and anti-Semitism. And these comic book creators, it's so interesting. It's been said that they poured a lot of their own losses of their heritage and their own identity into these characters. We also know that Siegel, it's interesting because Superman was the concept of Superman was really created only a few weeks after the death of Siegel's father, Siegel and Schuster, who were the young teenage boys who created Superman. And it came right after the weeks of the death of his father. So
it's really interesting. And I learned from your book too, that the Siegel, his dad died in an attempted robbery as well, which I think has a particular pathos with when you think about Superman and somebody who can go in and stop, robberies and stop crime from happening. So the sense that the superheroes kind of come in almost as a fantasy for the past that you can change or the future you can redeem, as in the case, with Spider-Man. I wonder if I could go back. You talked about Batman and how, he's often perceived as having complicated grief or prolonged grief. And I wonder about the way these stories illuminate different grieving styles and also the importance of our continuing relationship with the person who's died.
So Doka and Martin came up with the fact that patterns of grieving are not solely related to gender, but to style of mourning. And it's related to personality type, culture, temperament, developmental phases. So why do we put these labels and these biases on people about grief based on genders? This is really a non-gender conforming way to look at saying people grieve in different styles. I can even talk from my own personal experience when my mom died. My uncle was at her bedside crying much more than my aunt was. It didn't mean my aunt wasn't grieving. And so, Doka and Martin say that there's patterns that people have. People who are more intuitive, maybe emphasizing the experiencing the expression of emotion more. People who are more instrumental grievers focus more on the practical and the problem solving. They usually are the decision makers. Most people are a blended pattern between intuitive and instrumental. But oftentimes, sometimes you see people who are dissonant grievers. And we see this a lot in the superhero world. That is that, there's a heavy amount of grief and there's a discontinuity that someone might experience grief. They should be experiencing grief sort of at a higher affective level. But for one reason or another, they suppress these emotions. They suppress them. And we often see this with Bruce Wayne and Batman. He'd be considered more of a dissonant griever. He should in some way be expressing a little bit more. Same as Wonder Woman. We see that example in the Justice League, when she talks about how she's really sort of suppressed her grief for about 100 years.
Yeah, so, no, that makes sense. And I think the Batman example is really interesting because there's a sense, as you say, that he has, these intense feelings of grief, but actually what he presents to the world is this very strong, even cold person. It's as if, the mask that he wears is not just plastic. He has a kind of face he puts to the world, but actually that disconnect between the Batman image and the kind of vulnerable person underneath it is part of the kind of tension or the issue. Yeah.
And he says there's a discontinuity. He says this to Rachel as she puts his hand on his face, and he says, "This is really my mask." He's not talking about the Batman mask. He's talking about the mask of his face. Yeah. So, really talking about styles. And one of the other issues that you bring up, and I'll try to be fast about it because I know we're getting close to time, is, this whole issue of continuing bonds theory. We used to say old theory, Freud did a lot, but a lot of kind of not good stuff came out of the 1940s. And his whole theory that in order to really do grief work, you needed to cut off your relationship with the deceased, which is interesting because he wrote his deceased daughter letters for 30 years. He said only the healthy way to grieve, because, we have to tell people how to grieve based on our westernized, our westernized norms, usually coming from a white society. We have to tell people how to grieve. We don't take culture into context. That you really need to cut off that relationship to the deceased. And so continuing bonds, we saw a lot of damage this did to people, because how can you really cut off a person that you love? So Klaas, Silverman, and Nickman came up with this whole theory of what we call continuing bonds. And that is that a person may die physically, but we can still have an eternal bond, a relationship in the absence presence, a continued eternal relationship with that person. And a number of studies have found that for the bereaved population experience a sense of presence of the deceased in their lives. I mean, if you love somebody, how do you ever just forget about them? And that's what psychology was telling us to do. And so, we see now continuing bonds, we have to consider it in a cultural context. I mean, who are we to say in that type of psychology in the 40s when we had cultures around the world that, a lot of them believe this continued ancestral bond is an important part of grieving and honoring and remembering and respecting and very healthy. But we see this now, like we see it in the superhero world. One of my favorite examples is, Superman. Superman, whose father, his father Jor-El died, and his Earth father Jonathan Kent dies. And totally agree with Ryan. With all his superpowers, he has to understand the finality of death, because he doesn't have the powers to bring back both his birth father and his adopted father. But when he goes to try to lean on that, to be in the presence of his father, to gain some insight, some memories, some direction and guidance, Kal-El goes to Jor-El in the Fortress of Solitude, and he takes out those memory sticks. And oftentimes I'll do this in grief counseling with a lot of my clients, is leaning on those memories with the deceased, leaning on that connection. We see this often with families when, if there's unresolved business, visiting a grave and having that conversation sometimes, working out that unfinished business through oral dialogue. It could also be, memorial events. I've worked with surviving military families here in the United States, and memorial events are very important to be part of, to honor the absence presence of their loved one.
Yeah, that's really good, and I like that idea, and I think it rings true that it's about carrying the people we love with us. It's not about breaking those bonds, but it's about finding ways to represent them, to integrate the person who's died, and keeping them as a presence in our life. And I think the Superman example is great. I wonder though if we could turn to Jess. Jess, I wonder if I can just start by asking you to share a little bit about you and about your grief story.
Yeah, of course. So I actually lost my dad when I was 16. So he was diagnosed with the most aggressive form of brain tumor when he was 45 and I was 15. And we were a very close family, and it was completely out of the blue. So we kind of had 10 months together to kind of say goodbye, which is more than, many people get. But it never feels long enough. And then I kind of was thrown into this world of grief that I'd never really known about before. I'd kind of lost my granddad and I'd lost a dog. But I think it's a very different kind of grief when it's such a close bond. And my dad was so young and so healthy, and it was a shock. And I think even with terminal illnesses, it's still, you begin to grieve before they've even left, because you're kind of grieving the life that you could have had together. And every day you're spending knowing that you're about to plunge into a much deeper grief. And again, I was very young. And at the time, I didn't really have any friends who had kind of gone through the same thing. I'd made friends in sixth form, thankfully, that did. But I really struggled to relate to people, because I'd go back into school, and the thing was, my dad died on the first day of my GCSE exams. So 5 hours later, I was walking into my first exam and facing people my age at school. And it kind of, there was that moment where you kind of think everything feels normal. And then halfway through the exam, I kind of realized actually nothing was ever going to be the same again. And I knew kind of that moment that actually I was never going to relate to all these people in a room ever again. We had very different life experiences, and it was kind of going to be different from now on. So I kind of struggled through the next 2 years of sixth form, but I really struggled to have those conversations. I felt like you could see on my face how I felt, but I couldn't get it out in words. And I'm usually very good at articulating how I feel, but you don't really learn the language of grief. So when it happens, you don't know how to say anything other than I feel quite sad, or I don't feel well. And if you're sat having a panini in, the cafeteria, the last thing you want to say is, I feel really depressed, or I don't really know how to move forward. I don't know what's next. And yeah, so I didn't have a lot of those conversations until I was quite a bit older. And it did just unlock a world of mental health issues for me, especially depression. And no one at the time said to me, or kind of saw the signs, even like pupil support at school. So I kind of was left in this state of kind of a really deep sense of grief and depression. And I did do what we're going to talk about as well with WandaVision, but I felt very much like Wanda did, where I would kind of escape in a way into kind of film and TV for that comfort, because I didn't have the support network around me at that time. I did with my family, but just not with my friends, which was completely understandable. And I think also I thought at the time I was very old. I thought I was kind of very wise, and I knew, what I needed to know. So it kind of felt like life was pushing me to get back to normal and just continue on with life and get out of it and get over it. Because again, no one really teaches you that it's never going to go away and it's never going to get better. It's never going to get any smaller. Your life just gets bigger around the loss and the person in the life that you had together. But because no one had explained that and I hadn't experienced it, it was just a very long learning curve for me.
Yeah, and you were really young as well, which, makes perfect sense. And that sense of being, different from your peers is sort of makes that even harder. Can you say a little bit more about WandaVision and perhaps the way that show resonated with your own experiences of grief?
So I thought WandaVision was spectacular. I kind of went into the show, I kind of thought it would maybe touch on grief, but it hadn't really been on my radar. So I think the fact that it was also kind of unexpected made it even more powerful than I'd ever imagined it would be. But again, I think, we've talked about Batman, and the thing you see with Batman is a lot of rage. And, in grief comes a lot of anger. And you never really see that with women, because if you're kind of the woman who's angry, you're usually the villain rather than the protagonist of the story and the hero. So it was really interesting to me. And I related a lot to Wanda, because she was very angry and she couldn't process her grief. And everything that I felt when I was 16, she externalized in the hex. So she hid away in the hex from all of her feelings to try and move forward, but also kind of take comfort and find a place of safety in a pocket of time outside of her life and responsibilities to process what was going on. And she kind of went back to her sitcoms and these kind of safe havens where nothing bad happens, no one under 80 dies. You kind of know what's going to happen because the same thing happens in every show. And that is exactly what I did. I completely retreated into these kind of other worlds that would provide a bit of comfort. And at the time, you wonder if they're helping or hindering you, but I think they definitely serve a purpose. And I think WandaVision is a very meta example of how that kind of process with TV and also that kind of escapism can help in some ways as well. But I think especially towards the last two episodes, because ultimately Wanda has to give up her family again. And it's that kind of, I think the perfect line for me was the only way forward is back, which Agatha tells Wanda as she kind of makes her revisit all these really deep traumas from her life. And I think that kind of sums up the whole show, and it sums up grief and it sums up therapy. But this idea that actually, in order to process grief, you kind of have to go back to the life you had with them, go back to everything, go back through it and make peace with it and see where this rage and this kind of trauma happened and look at it again, which is really painful. But I think that WandaVision was really powerful because she works through her grief and you kind of follow her through that, and she comes out the other side. And ultimately it's having the strength to accept that whatever life you had before, whatever you thought you were owed from life, which is a happy, outcome for her and Vision in WandaVision, she really wanted that perfect, picture perfect life, and it's a life she can never get. So it's kind of the loss of the life you feel owed as well as the loss of a person. And I just felt like I really could relate to that, because that's exactly how I felt from losing my dad at such a young age and being kind of very quickly in my life turned from being very ordinary to very different to how I ever imagined it would be.
That's really beautiful, and some lovely analysis of WandaVision. I found it really fascinating how Agatha, who's kind of, in a sense, the baddie of the piece, also acts as the therapist. As you say, it's actually Agatha who, pushes her to go back, to relive the memories, and also to confront the way in which she's retreated from her life into this fictional world where Vision is still alive and with her. You talk about stories.
Real quick,
oh, yeah,
Lisa. I just want to piggyback on. That struck me that you said that Agatha's the baddie, but she's the one who leads the therapy session, because she is the source of conflict. And in a lot of ways, if she didn't have that conflict, that other character trying to work against the reality that she's created, then she would never confront the past. I think it's exactly, you just nailed it with. To go forward, you have to go back. And narratively, that's why. I just think it's pretty brilliant of the show to take this character who is an antagonist, but make her the pathway to dealing with trauma. That's it.
As a grief therapist and a trauma grief therapist, I want to also point out that I know, because, the storyline is short and everything, the way in which she does it in a grief therapy standpoint is exceptionally cruel. And so we would never do that to a client, because that's called exposure therapy. And so what we're going to do with a client is we're going to create a safe harbor. We're going to create resiliency in a safe harbor and coping, or as Dr. Ted Rainerson calls, before bringing them down, giving them a golden thread before bringing them into the hole of darkness. And so, she is mind manipulating Wanda. What's done. So I wanted to make that caveat, because oftentimes, people who are not even seasoned grief and trauma therapists or the general public will say, well, this person needs to confront their grief. They need to really just be shocked into the reality of it. And, by doing that to a person, you can really actually damage them more and create more trauma. And so it's really embracing, pacing, and being knowledgeable of what you need to do before you bring somebody into that darkness, because they do have to, in order to really live with grief, it is moving through the process and working through the pain.
And doing it kind of slowly at their own pace, rather than through this kind of confrontational way. If you want to get really meta, though, you could say that the TV show and the shows that she goes into are her safe space. And it's kind of through the television shows. If you almost take Agatha as another externalized voice within herself, it's within that safe space that she can kind of have that conversation or start thinking about it. This kind of leads me to another question I wanted to ask of all of you, which is really, and maybe I can start with Jess, but this question about where stories sit in grief. Because if we take WandaVision as an example, on the one hand, Wanda goes into the TV shows, and it is her escape. And it was for you, Jess, it's a sort of safe space where what's going to happen, the end. But on the other hand, again, for you, Jess, and for others, watching TV can be a way of you feeling emotions, thinking about your own life, your own experiences. So I just wonder if you could maybe just start us on that sort of dual function of stories.
Yeah, I think the thing is, like, stories can really teach you something about yourself that maybe you've forgotten or you didn't know. And I think for me, WandaVision just woke something up that I'd forgotten existed. And that was very painful. And it was, again, very confronting for me in a way. Like, I almost felt like I was reliving my own trauma by watching Wanda address hers. But I think they have, like you say, there's this duality where they both provide comfort and safety and escapism, which, you know, it's such a great thing that comic book films, especially superhero films, do for us. They're great stories of escapism, but there are so many deep themes and things that we can really relate to and take into our own lives. And I think especially with grief, you know, not everyone wants to sit down and watch a drama about grief and really explore kind of the deep, minute, kind of physical manifestations of grief in a natural way. They would much rather see it, you know, in a hex, in a really big CGI kind of specialized way. And I think it just makes things become clearer for yourself as well. You can kind of see how emotions feel, you can relate to something, so you feel less alone. And I think the whole process with grief and mental health is very isolating because we don't really talk about it, and there's still quite a lot of taboo around it and stigma. That actually having that space or having that connection, even with the person who's fictional that you'll never meet in a character, is really important, and it can actually bring you so much comfort to know that you're not alone, and also guidance sometimes that actually how to work through the space that you're in right now and the mental state that you're kind of in to move forward. Because a lot of these stories, they get through it, they come out the other side, and then they go on, and then the film stops, obviously, but our life will continue and you live in hope that you will get better. And I think that's a really important message.
That's really interesting. There's something about the fact it's us and not us at the same time. Jill, do you want to come into that?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about, I know it probably felt like escapism to you. And as someone in the social work field and psychology, I would really do a full evaluation on whether someone's trying to escape their grief. But it sounds like to me, you know, oftentimes people need respite from their pain. I would sort of reframe it from respite and more respite. Someone can't be in pain completely 24/7. Now, there are some people who are escaping or pushing away or denying or avoiding completely. And that can lead to what we call prolonged grief disorder, can lead to more complications or prolonged suffering and grief.
I hate to cut off our conversation here, but I'm looking at the clock and I can absolutely see that we are out of time. But I just want to thank our panelists. This has been such a fascinating conversation about grief. There's so many characters we still haven't touched on, but I think what we did manage to talk about was really rich, and I really appreciate the wisdom and reflections from Ryan, Jill, and Jess. So thank you very much for joining Good Grief, and thank you to our audience as well, and we'll see you next time.